Hello, I'm Madeline Jekot, and I'm here to talk about pie. Well, not just pie, but how to braid pie crust. Now, one question that might pop into your head is why would somebody want to or need to know how to braid pie crust? It's a good question. So, imagine you are in a restaurant and you've just ordered dessert, and the waiter turns the corner holding a piece of pie with a mountain range of whipped cream and a perfectly golden braided crust. The sheer sight of the pie screams that it will be delicious, and the excitement builds as it inches closer and closer to your table. This is why. Not only is presentation key, but baking can be seen as an art form and in a way for people to express themselves. And one summer I was baking pies and I got really bored of them. It wasn't a challenge anymore, and I decided I wanted to improve my skills. So I decided to sit down and learn how to braid pie crust. Now today we're going to talk about where to begin, making the braid, and how to attach it. So to start off, you need to choose a recipe that will allow you to work and braid the dough. So try to stay away from doughs that are made from crushed cookies because they won't hold the shape. You want to go to doughs that have a flour and fat base, whether that fat be a butter or shortening, doesn't really matter. But these doughs are best workable because you can shape them better and they stay together. So after choosing a recipe for the dough, you should gather some supplies. You'll need some of the basics like bowls and maybe a fork, but also rolling pin, ruler, pie pan, pizza cutter, or other knife are also supplies you should gather. Next, check to see if your recipe is for a single layer or double layer pie. If you are using a dough recipe that says it's for a single layer, this will not be enough dough for the base crust and the braid. You will need to make double the recipe so you can have half of it for the base and then the other half for the braid. Now, if you have a crust for a double layer, that should be enough crust to make both the decoration and the base. So now you need to start working with the dough. After you've made the dough, roll it into a ball and cut it in half. The first half will be for the base, the other half will be for the decoration. To make the base crust, roll out the first half of the dough into about a 1/8 inch thick circle. Just make sure it's long enough to cover the pie crust. Now there are a few methods to putting this dough onto the pie pan. You can either roll it up using the rolling pin and loosely roll over the dough and then roll it back out onto the pie dish, or you can lightly lift up the dough, slide a cutting board underneath, transfer it to the pie dish, and slide it back off. After you have the dough covering it, you want to make sure that you press it down enough so that there's no weird holes and it fills the actual pie pan. Then also, trim the edges so you have a nice clean cut edge of your pie. Now that you have the base crust on, it's time to start forming the braid. So roll out the second half, also about 1/8 of an inch thick, into either a circle or rectangle. It doesn't really matter the length of these braids. You'll just attach them together if you needed more length. So then mark at the top every 1/4 of an inch or 1/8 of an inch on the top and bottom of the rolled out dough. I prefer to do 1/4 of an inch strips because they're easier to work with, they don't break as much, and it gives you a nice thicker braid. But if you'd like to have a thin braid, you can work with the 1/8 of an inch strips. Just know that they break easier. And make sure that you have a 1/4 of an inch and a 1/4 of an inch on the same one, and you have the same markers. Next, take your ruler, and I prefer pizza cutter, line up the marks and cut even strips. The key is to make even strips because you want to make sure that your braid looks uniform and smooth. Uneven strips will kind of deform the braid and make it look strange. So now you have a bunch of strips, you can start actually making the braid. Take 3 of your strips and put them in front of you, leaving just a little bit of space in between them. Next, you're going to want to pinch the tops of them together so that if you pull it, it doesn't pull apart super easily. They don't have to be fully attached, but just enough so that when you're braiding, your braid does not come apart when you are taking, or when you're taking the braid. Now, I always suggest a practice braid because each dough is slightly different in how it wants to bend or twist, so you're going to want to make sure that you know how to work with the dough. Also, braiding dough is different than braiding hair because if you braid hair, sometimes you want a really tight braid and that works well for hair. But if you try to do a super tight braid on dough, you'll end up breaking the dough or deforming the braid and it won't look quite right. So you normally lay over and not pull super tight on the braids. Now you're going to want to either start on the table or already on the pie dish. I prefer to start on the pie pan and the base crust already because it has a more natural curve for the pie dish, and also you don't have to transfer it. Now if you want to start the braid on the table and then move it onto the pie dish, that's fine. Just know that in transferring it might break and can be difficult to repair. So now it is time to actually make the braid. So now that you have it lumped together at the top, you're going to take the rightmost piece and move it over across onto over the center, and so it's now the new center. Then you're going to take the left piece of the braid and do the same thing so it becomes the new center. You want these crossovers to kind of lay on top of each other and not be super tight, but enough to get the point through that it's a braid and not just lightly crossed over pieces. Again, this is why you want to practice braid, because the act of braiding changes with each different dough. Now you're going to repeat crossing over left and right to make the new center until you have braided the 3 strips together. This braid will most likely not be long enough to cover your entire circumference of your pie, and therefore you're going to need to attach strips to the ends. Now in attaching strips to the ends, I prefer to use an egg wash, which is just an egg that is either whisked or you use a fork to mix the whites and the yolk together. This can act as a pie glue and will be mentioned later. So then you're going to want to put a little bit of egg wash on both strips of the dough and then combine them together and work them together a little bit. Now ideally that you will be able to attach 2 pieces of dough together and hide it under one of the crossovers, although this does not always happen and can be a good reason to start the braid on the pie crust and not, because in transferring the braid, those attachments can fall off easily. So now that you've attached them, you continue to braid until you have far enough to go around the entire circumference. All that you have left to do is to attach the braid. Now, if you've started on the pie crust, what you're going to do is use more of that egg wash and lightly lift up the braid in sections, put a little bit of egg wash underneath, and then press it down on the dough. Make sure when you're pressing that you don't deform the braid or break the braid because it is still a little fragile. You just want to make sure that there's contact between the braid, the egg wash, and the other dough. If you've started on the table, my suggestion is to egg wash little sections and carefully lift the braid and then carry the braid off in sections. This is because the egg wash can dry, and if the egg wash is dry, it no longer helps the dough stick together. Egg wash can be applied to the top of the braid after you've attached it if you want a darker golden brown crust. You do not need to do this. That is a completely optional step. Now congratulations, all you have left to do is to bake your pie according to the directions on your recipe. After all this hard work, you will have a beautiful braided pie crust. Now, things to remember are choose the best dough that's easily workable and not made from crushed cookies. To make even strips so that everything works out and that your braid is nice and even. And then finally, to use egg wash to help stick the braid to the base crust. Thank you so much for watching. Hope you have a great day.